Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A frequent but rather overdue turn in recent Western scholarship on Islamic theology and law has been the observation, rather an obvious one for traditional madrasa alumni, that classical Muslim thought quite typically favoured indeterminate and probabilistic positions. It's the conclusion reached by Aaron Zeisau and Wael Hallaq, two major interpreters of the tradition. Pre-modern Islam was, as indicated by the title of Bauer's recent book, a culture of ambiguity. Before modernization, the Muslim world was characterized by a dynamic yet socially sustaining polysemy, so that, as Bauer says, the process of making ambiguous is constitutive of Sunnism. These authors have not hesitated to offer views on the contemporary meaning of this discovery. For instance, Bauer speculates on the postmodern potential of the Islamic post-formative tradition, hoping that it renders Muslim theology particularly fluid and open to engagement with the drift of contemporary German and European moral culture. The rather transparent subcolonial instrumentalizing of the heritage apart, any scrutiny of the post-formative Muslim canon will generally bear out this perception of polysemy, which it's taken Orientalism rather too long to apprehend. Possibly there's a parallel in the sluggishness of old European discussions about Jewish law, which assumed a natural disloyalty to the nation-state in Torah-observant Jews, who were thought to be wedded to a closed and immutable canon which defined their identity and difference, before it was noticed that rabbinic culture in its dominant Talmudic mode represents precisely a culture of ambiguity, with Judaic authenticity conceived as the habitus of a mobile conversation. But we're not going to pursue that analogy here. Instead, my purpose in launching this Manon d'essai will be to show scriptural, mystical, and philosophical theological tawhid as presenting an internal etiology and grammar which may generate a rather distinctive but not unintelligible mode of engagement with late modern conversations in the publicly secular West. To this end, I will recruit the French philosopher and artist Pierre Klossowski, whose distinctive contribution to the pathology of modern subjectivity derived in large measure from an unusual cohabitation of Nietzsche with St. Teresa of Avila, offers a suggestive indication of how to parse Sunnism's juxtaposition of revealed certainty with a culture of ambiguity and of openness. The debate is obviously significant. Across Europe now, under the alarm of nativists, non-migrant birth rates are in free fall. This we might term the biopause, an evolution which seems to follow two stages. Firstly, post-industrial secularizing humanity ruptures the symbiosis with other orders of nature, prompting their rapid collapse. And this is followed by a second episode in which humanity itself turns away from self-replication. The sexual revolution of the 1960s, detached now from the Haight-Ashbury spiritualities which sought to sacralize it, has simply generated a declining non-proleptic libidinal which has perfectly inverted the Augustinian ideal of procreation without desire. The pandemic of dissociative identity disorders intensifies this sense of disengagement from the body, while Jung's eternal child, puer aeternus, is the inevitable fruit of the puberty blockers delivered by modern education. We have fewer children, but childhood lasts for longer. Towards this biopausal Europe sails a flotilla of flimsy arcs carrying migrants who mostly bear the charism of Ishmael and Hajar, archetypal exile people. These new Europeans are not only pre-biopausal in their fecundity, but remain rooted in traditional cultures with high and even rising levels of religiosity, as suggested by the 15th Arab Youth Survey this year, or by Michael Robbins of the Arab Barometer, who observes, as he says, that youth aged 18 to 29 have led the return to religion across the Middle East and North Africa over the past 10 years. Against this, there is Europe's eternal return to its dichotomy of self and other, and the new sub-Christian nationalisms emerging across the continent, the reappearance of a chronic immune reaction against the Semitisms, pitch Apollo against Dionysus, the linear and the closed against the biotic and polymorphous, a perennial theme of European self-definition since the time of Euripides. But some are asking James Baldwin's question, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? To some Muslim skeptics, the late modern West presents a schema of demerits, the fentanyl zombies of inner-city Portland or Philadelphia, the mental health plague, the culture wars which in the name of diversity stigmatize the traditional social practices of many migrants, and a growing economic stasis combined with deepening structural inequality. Never has Adorno's question seemed less absurd of why mankind, instead of entering into a truly human condition, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism, generated by the indefatigable self-destructiveness of enlightenment. Thus we hear assorted, provocative prophecies of an Ishmaelite future. Bishop Athanasius Schneider, for instance, tells us that a Muslim Europe is inevitable, while the atheist Camille Paglia predicts that the passion of Islam will win throughout the West, just as Christianity once won over the epicene, androgynous and hedonistic Roman Empire. As she writes, I will continue to celebrate androgyny, but I am under no illusions about what it may portend for the future. It seems more likely, of course, that the West will be taken over by artificial general intelligence rather than by Muslims. It is the West's science which will turn the lights off and complete the biopause. But our question presses. Mainstream political thought has been allergic to dealing with the Ishmaelite presence in the Western mix and with the associated Muslim political theories. It took 9/11 to jolt Habermas out of his musings on something he was calling the Judeo-Christian persistence. And the sociological and ethnographic accounts even less frequently take account of Islam's internal theological and juridical processes, while Bauer's promising culture of ambiguity is hardly referenced at all. As Talal Asad complains, it is too often forgotten that the world of Islam is a concept for organizing historical narratives, not the name for a self-contained collective agent. But slowly there is taking place a grand remplacement of the episteme. In the universities, Christian theology is giving way to religious studies, but Orientalism is giving way to normative Muslims who choose to operate in a theological idiom. Weber's steel cage is being unexpectedly rattled. If academe is the keystone to Debord's spectacle, which is the ruling order's non-stop discourse about itself, its never-ending monologue of self-praise, hierarchical society's ambassador to itself, let us claim that Islamic theology represents the most significant site of epistemic difference in the academy, resisting the intense conformism of academic coloniality, which assumes the unique appropriateness of discourses flowing from Europe's Enlightenment. Even post-colonial theory scarcely impresses as an alternative, subaltern-aligned episteme. Gayatri Spivak, for instance, was a convent girl, and her voice does seem magisterially Western. The academy continues to melt and reconstitute the other through the pyroclastic flow of colonial westernization throughout the globe. One could say, il n'y a pas d'Occident, and this maxim is hardly unthought. But it can be claimed just that an Ishmaelite theology, rooted in the immensity of Islam's library and the Sunnah Lebensform, is emerging as a site of discordance and rupture, interrogating the doctrine that only the West generates true universals, and that the ethical is rightly determined only among nos semblables, Rawls's cosy guild of good people. Ishmael here, as scripturally, is the exceptional paradigmatic outsider, the Comanche outside the ring of wagons. His does remain a site of extreme precarity. His thinking flickers in a sort of intellectual dark web unsuspected by elites. But as a Klossowskian reading of subjectivity suggests, he is a paradigm of the westernly unthought, a Semitic advocate of a polysemy of alternate indices of truth. If the Frankfurt School is ultimately yet another self-referential epicycle of a Eurocentric historiography, then classical Islam, or some interpretation thereof, is a metacritical theory. We shall see how this might go shortly. Bauer's account of Ishmaelite discursive polysemia does not attempt a deep probing of its origins, the logic of Kalam and Sufism as the substrate of the diverse Islamic form of life is not assessed. He does, however, note the etiology of its contemporary surrogates. Islamism and most of the Salafi fundamentalisms comprise by their own logic a linearization of Islam. Vincent Cornell describes how their Sharia has been transformed by a reactive engagement with colonialism to become, as he says, a creedal calculus. Instead of an umbrella of inclusiveness, ideological Islam has become a totem of separateness. So the war on terror is, as John Gray insists, a Western civil war, with traditional Muslims looking on in perplexity, while the Islamists burn the libraries and carry out autos da fe against the surviving custodians of the old polysemy. This paroxysmic utopianism is not a reformation so much as a deformation. It deforms the culture of ambiguity into a totalitarian Western imposition of a strong linearity. In Khaldunian fashion, the conquered have once more emulated the conquerors. Linearization and the general homogenization of the Sunni conversation were the outcomes of 19th and 20th century Muslim reflexes against the Occidental colonial insistence on systematic Western ratio as the guarantor of organizational and military triumph, yoked unevenly to Wahhabizing rejections of creedal and practical difference. Traditional Muslim analysis attacks this deformation from multiple angles, the variety of which seems to support the authenticity of their polemic. For instance, the Bosnian theologian Rusmir Mahmud Cehajic, who has written extensively on what he calls the ideological distortion of Islam, identifies a failure to recall scriptures or anthropology. It's immemorial, the verse at Surah 7, verse 172, which shows humanity united in affirmation of the Creator's presence in a prologue in heaven, and which goes on to remark, "Had thy Lord willed, he would have made mankind one nation, but they continue in their differences." The anamnesis of a before-birth world enables the thought of the equal otherness of human others, and a sharpened conscience of theophanic difference. More than in Plato's Phaedo, the memory of a lost congregation of souls reveals a divine purpose in manifesting the human order. This diagnosis by Mahmud Cehajic seems credible, and it is certainly interesting that the Islamists seldom cite this verse, which pre-Deformation Muslims had regarded as foundational. His seems to be only one form of the diagnosis, however, and here, to suggest pathways to the retrieval of a full theology of Muslim participation in contemporary debates on morality and citizenship, I will attempt to list some other determinants of the post-formative culture of ambiguity, locating these ultimately in the justifying principle of the Ishmaelite form of life. One place to start, quite distinct from Mahmud Cehajic's, might be Louis Massignon's understanding of Islam as a type of Judeo-shamanism. Pondering the mystery of the Quran's appearance after Christ, he describes it as a kind of divine reminder or pointer to the natural law. Islam shows God achieving what he calls a temporal involution, a remontée towards the most distant past. Abraham ends the tribal and points to the axial, but the charism of Ishmael retrieves the non-linearity of the primeval past without replacing Isaac's particularity with an Arab ethnocentrism. Islam is axial in Karl Jaspers's sense and seeks to transform every people even though its metabolism is recognizably archaic. The Arabic language is, to quote Massignon, the purest Semitic language whose word order prioritizes the action over the agent. Anthropocentrism is thus ruled out, as in archaic times. Its immense lexicon of synonyms and near-synonyms and its mantic cadences express the Ishmaelite oracle to the one who is wrapped in his mantle, the truth-teller of the newly universal Abrahamic. Even the alphabet seems to reflect this. Ideograms, hieroglyphs, Hebrew, Gutenberg, and QWERTY divide locutions with interruptions, while the Arabic script is cursive, female, polymorphous, Selenic. Non-paratactic in sentence structure, the enchanted language's perlocutionally yield on the enraptured hearer is more often an infinite sequence of intensities than a logical sequence of argument. The scripture does not begin in the beginning, but is, almost in Deleuze's and Guattari's sense, a rhizome, a mass of roots, its internal structure permitting many equal points of entry and cessation. Unlike the linear and arborescent pattern of static Western thought, the rhizomic discourse seems to oppose, in Masomi's sense, the state philosophy of the West with the sort of nomadic thought commended in the Anti-Oedipus. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the ultimate statement of nonlinear writing in Europe, Finnegan's Wake, is replete with Quranic and Islamic references. Klossowski's novel Le Baphomet recurrently indicates this. Describing the present age in which no further souls may be saved, it declares that a new humanity, beyond good and evil, has been created. In this post-salvific environment, we become newly aware of the irrelevance of fixity and closure, and the importance only of variations in intensity. Linear time breaks down, as in Finnegan's Wake, and the Qur'an's fluid use of tenses. Islam is always the subtext. Teresa of Avila, the mystic profoundly influenced by Sufism, discourses anachronistically with a character named Friedrich, who is simultaneously Frederick Barbarossa, the philo-Islamic king who attempted to overthrow Christendom's societal uniformity, and also Nietzsche, who identified Islam with the Dionysian principle against Christianity, understood as the sign of Apollonian detachment from the flesh and the victory of ressentiment. The strange novel weaves together many themes, but ultimately considers the eternal return, Nietzsche's experienced dynamic ontology of flux, which, as in Escherism, seems to deny the reality of time. Expansion and contraction are simultaneous. At the highest philosophy is a sudden disclosure of this, as happened famously to Nietzsche himself, made ecstatic by the majestic enigma of the Engadine. Deleuze and Guattari, in their search for a nomadic retrieval of a more organic and embodied subjectivity, locate one form of this in the sister Semitism. In their short book on Kafka, they note the eminence of what they call the tensor, the contronym with multiple opposing indications, frequent in the Hebrew language of Kafka's forebears. The supreme gift of Scripture turns out to be not the law, but the polyvalent exegesis of the rabbis. The radical embodiedness of the cantillated discourse with its glottal stops and vocalized tonalities suggests language as a kind of bodily secretion. In its organicism, it is variant, cyclical, and affective. This reading of rabbinic culture seems to indicate a way of understanding the textuality of Muslim revelation. The very bodily symptoms of the initial prophetic reception, the infleshed courtesies and pharyngeal and labial control required by tajweed cantillation, all bespeak the archaic-sounding organicism of the oracle. As Nietzsche insisted, thought begins with the body, not the mind. The text's ambiguities yield parallel significations which are not resolved through any Hegelian dialectic, but are frequently left to stand by the commentarial tradition of tafsir. Again, the contrast with Islamism is very notable. We could begin to say here in Nietzschean terms that the normative Ishmaelite reception of the oracle is Dionysian, while the modern Islamist reading is Apollonian, in what the sage of Germany would consider a subversive Pauline turn. This incantatory poem, syncopated by the conventions of oral and not literate culture, forbids the confinement of meaning by its intensity. Recall Byung-Chul Han. A poem has a sensual physical dimension that eludes its sense, the signified. It is the excess of the signifier that condenses the poem into a thing. In the Qur'an's case, the primordialism of the narrative evokes ancient validations of the libidinal, experienced not as a prompt towards acquisition, but as an aspiration of the divine name Al-Hayy, the living, in the human clay. The Sunnah is thus a paradigm of the Dionysian. The Qur'an produces a reality which finds that the divine inscriber has written his nature into nature itself, in which a will to power is recognized as a true part of nature. Desiring a desirable cosmos, which the book sensuously describes, and the libidinal function, not limited to the erotic, constructs a reality in the auditor's subconscious, or what Klossowski will call a simulacrum, that slowly sees cosmic diversity as a pleroma of the one. So where the scripture says that all the oceans turned to ink would not suffice for God's words, it hints that only orality can carry the proper intensity of the logos, the word-made book. Ink must be finite. The divine speech, like all the divine essential attributes, is finite when distinguished from God, but infinite when understood as a modality or hypostatic evolution of his essence. The signifier is infinitely excessive, and so exegetic closure is inconceivable. The auditor hears an arabesque whose repeated geometry has no natural bounds. But although the meaning is only an indicant, dalala, and not a definitive account, the song of this super-replete logos has shaped the impulses of the Ishmaelite audience, creating a diverse but nonetheless broadly recognizable Muslim habitus of values. God's nature is absolutely other, and the messenger advised us not to think about its essence, but traces of its norms in history are recounted in Scripture's prophetic pericopes. From these epics, the listener understands that Islam came with an ethically reparative purpose. Not only do the prophetic sagas, most of which hint at collectivist and political impulses, cumulatively shape the Muslim sense of God's moral nature, but they also indicate that Ishmaelite religion is more than an affirmation of previous Abrahamic stories. The Bible's texts of terror, some of which are so alarmingly deployed by modern Christian and Jewish nationalists, are processed and ethicized. Hajar herself, the proto-foundress, is retrieved. She becomes, to use the discrepant modern dialect, a paradigm of intersectionality. She is African, left in the desert by a patriarch, a single mother. Her sevenfold coursing between the Mount of Purity and the Mount of Chivalry ends not where she started, but at the latter. With her son, she does not return to Egypt or Chaldea, or even go to the Promised Land, but moves into alterity to refound the great sanctuary, where millions every year reenact the immemorial in this creolized and universalizing variant of Abrahamic adherence. Hajar and Ishmael then are retrieved, or in the anti-Oedipus sense, deterritorialized. The text is, as it were, more nomadic and Semitic than the Pentateuch, since the biblical and hence Western binary of chosen and unchosen is repudiated in favour of a drifting dyad of both and. Hence the polemic of Freud, Assmann and others, which identifies the crossing of the Red Sea as the beginning of the West's destructive binaries, collapses. Egypt cannot be an unchosen land for the Ishmaelites, thanks to their Hajarine DNA. One could repeat the scripture's strategy of systematic repair and inclusion with regard to the other dichotomizing biblical texts. As Shadab Rahimtullah has observed, the Exodus people wished to attack the Canaanites, but Moses and God punished them for this. The Herem sacred exterminations, which depict God, in Bergman's words, as morally chaotic, appear nowhere in the Quranic text. This reparative reading has been excellently documented by Michael Lodal, who speaks of how the Quran cleans up God's image, and also by Jack Miles, who shows how the great binaries such as Cain and Abel, Noah and his family, and the plagues of Egypt have been flattened and ethicized by the new revelation. Even Pharaoh now dies as a Muslim. As Miles writes, Allah is positively eager to forgive, while Yahweh has to be talked into it. For the Muslim ear shaped by the mantic song of these stories, the moral vindication of ancient Jewish history is one consequence. The brutal story of the ethnic cleansing of Canaan is a falsity, and this coheres with the Qur'an's exculpation of the Jews from the execution of Christ. But this new vision of a truly ethical Israel, deterritorialized as it were, forms only part of the story. Sacred history is not a Chaoskampf, despite the affirmation of difference. The narrative tells of a God who is recognizably moral, and moral even towards the other. In reality, the other, thanks to the common pledge of the immemorial, is no more than a facet of the same, provisionally unreached. Massignon, whose essay on Abraham's prayer for Ishmael remains one of the most profound meditations on the nature of Islamic reason in the context of tawhid, is clear-headed in seeing the shamanistic logic of its scripture as the determinant of Ishmael's refusal of linearity. Sufism is thus Islam's heart and its heart logic. Ratio is dichotomizing, while the heart allows gradation and ambiguity. One recalls Al-Kindi's state rationalism, or that imposed by Al-Ma'mun. Ratio, in the reductive Apollonian, non-nomadic, non-rhizomic sense, readily lends itself to totalitarianism, as Europe discovered during its 20th century romance with political Darwinism. It was thanks to Al-Ghazali that Islamic culture finally absorbed Hellenism as a broadening of their episteme, not as a restrictor of truths, still less as the basis for totalitarian government. Although not politically enforced, Asharite Kalam, of course, continued to be linear and dialectical. Freedom, in the Sufi sense of hurriya, is only enabled by ambiguity and curvature, that is, by the organic and the fully Dionysian, the right side, the yamin of the brain. It is proleptic, anticipating the celestial garden, whose eros is exorbitant because it is infinite. The proleptic libidinal of Islam, object of scholastic reproach, joins the Ishmaelite and the Hajarine to the organic and the cyclical, validating the indescribable impulses through a hikayah, the oracle's willed reproduction, which does not starve the impulses, but gives them a validating telos. One recalls here Klossowski's friendship and correspondence with Henri Corbin. In Ibn Arabi's thought, the metaphysical dyad, he, not he, with its resonances perhaps of Heisenbergian indeterminacy, defines the ambiguous and fragile ontology of all alterities. The world is God's unified and non-delimited imagination, an isthmus between existence and non-existence. Hence even God talk can be no more than an array of knots, uqad, provisional and perhaps soteriologically indicative tyings of a fabric of being which might perhaps be represented by alternative tyings. Hence the salvation history, which affirms the equal salvific force of thousands of earlier prophetic interventions. We distinguish not between any of God's messengers, as the scripture says, and every people has received a guide. Islamic normativities are Islamic normativities, although for the Ishmaelite and conclusive era in the history of tawhid, the knots it ties are by far the most indicatively effective in directing the impulses and hence rectifying the creative imagination. Ibn Arabi's supposed relativism, which leads to a rather subjective-seeming jurisprudence in which lawful verdicts and moral choices are produced by sainthood rather than juridical dialectic, thus appears to be a reasonable outcome of the scripture's insistence that laysa kamithlihi shay, nothing is like him and he is the seeing and the hearing, a verse which, as the Andalusian master points out, juxtaposes negation and affirmation, aporia and analogy. The book bathes the auditor in the 99 names, whose operative significance is hinted at in the prophetic sagas, and the man or woman who perfectly instantiates those names, the imago Dei, will be a perfectly social human whose participation in the social will be entirely positive. Showing how Quranic tawhid creates a world of ambiguity for the enraptured mystic is scarcely difficult. However, it's the formal madrasa discourse which exists not through Sufism but under the exoteric science of Kalam, which forms the presumptive context of Bauer and Hallaq's presentations of Islamic polysemy. Wayne Hankey has carefully shown how the philosophical secular in the West has roots in Aquinas, and his reception of medieval Islam's hospitality to a secular sacred. Aquinas built on the Kalam distinction between aql and naql, ratio and revelatory tradition, to create a realm of temporal knowledge which ultimately, he says, expanded to drive the sacred out. The polemic about Islam's failure to follow suit is familiar. Khalid Abul Fadl, in his dialogue The Place of Tolerance in Islam, is responding to a Straussian essay by Milton Vjost, who blames the perceived failure of modern Islam on the decline of Mu'tazilism. Assuming that Mu'tazilism was a rationalist school, Vjost inverts Abbasid history by blaming Islamist intolerance on Asharism and traditionalism, with their command ethic and their occasionalist ontology which allegedly obstructed the appearance of a Muslim Newton. At no point does he consider the totalizing and deterministic implications of Newtonian physics, which is, to deploy our binary again, Apollonian, where quantum mechanics might readily be seen as Dionysian. If most Muslim community and thought leaders in the Western space owe allegiance to some instantiation of Asharism, or for the Hanafis, the closely allied Maturidi school, this syllogism which holds that rationalism generates tolerance, Asharism is not rationalist, therefore Islam is intolerant, needs careful assessment. The frailty of the two premises requires no comment. Whose justice? Which rationality? An artificial intelligence government would likely be rational but would not necessarily be tolerant. In fact, Mu'tazilites fell out of favour partly because of their intolerance towards a diverse caliphal episteme, establishing the only official inquisition in Islamic history, while Wasil ibn Ata, founder of the school, left the mainstream because of his belief that grave sinners were unbelievers. In other words, Mu'tazilism was born in a mood of intolerance. The alleged irrationalism of Asharite tawhid appears simply as a type of skeptical theism enabled by the transcendentalism of the scripture. So the Quranic anthropomorphisms are interpreted figuratively by Mu'tazilism and literally by Hanbalites, while Asharis insist that both of these closures are presumptuous. The strategy of bila kaif, without how, becomes a key Asharite hermeneutic policy whose indeterminacy reflects the school's epistemic humility. God does not resemble anything, and speech is simply an intermediary which permits analogies which may licitly diverge. Tawhid entails not only his unity, but his solitary and incommensurable uniqueness. The meaning of Scripture, as of the divine names, is determined by God and not by our mental operation. In his analysis of Baqillani's theology, David Vishanov shows how divine discourse is intrinsically equivocal by reason of the capacity of the Arabic language to imply this aseity. This supports Asharism's fallibilism. Theology seeks an approximative assessment and necessarily permits alternatives which the community validates as permissible within the linguistic and historical exegetical context. In the theology of Ramon Harvey, Maturidism in particular is an open theology, prioritizing meaning over systematic foundationalist proof, a conception of the Kalam tradition that is self-reflective about its own contingency. The Quranic rhizome points to an omnificent deity unconstrained by temporal limitation. Asharite occasionalism presents a cosmos of plastic flux in which the perceived regress of ontological causes is illusory, disguising God's habitual sequencing of moments rather than a simple Newtonian determinism. Toby Mayer has reflected on the convergence of this ontology with Ibn Arabi's supposed monism. All alleged causation is the unmediated immanent divine action, and Massignon observes that Islamic time is not a continuous duration but a Milky Way of instants. On Klossowski's understanding, this recalls Nietzsche's experience of his eternal return. Here we observe Tawhid pushed to the limits of its own logic. From the Ash'ari perspective, monotheism either establishes fixity and closure in God's created world, with the dualistic possibility of human intervention through the magic of free will, or, if it is totalizing, identifies complete contingency and therefore radical ambiguity. An acquisition, casp, by the human subject cannot intervene in a cosmic totality controlled by God's immanent agency, but by escaping the illusory web of causal chains, we experience the possibility of a dim but real human accountability. The ethical void proposed by free will denying atheists such as Dirk Pereboom, with its dire consequences for moral participation in the public square, and the de facto determinism of Marxian dialectical materialism, are thus averted by Asharism's conclusion that causal chains are not determinative but are only apparent habits, in the context of which humans may nonetheless pray for outcomes, and towards which they may, like the early Muslims, act politically. This cosmology is the ultimate generator of Islam's metacritical theory, which dismisses the Frankfurt school not only as colonial, as we suggested earlier, but as improperly rooted in a very outdated physics. Asharism's denial of simple binaries annoyed its Mu'tazilite rationalist critics, He wanted to know decisively, for instance, whether a divine attribute was identical with or different from the divine essence. If God's speech is not like human speech, they said, we cannot finally close its meaning, which frustrates the purpose of textual revelation. But the ambitious Asharite insistence that the Qur'an is unoriginated divine speech stripped God's commands of their direct perlocutionary force and transformed them into a rhizomatic mass of indicators, dalalat, and signs, isharat. Asharism, thus, is rationalistic insofar as it takes seriously the apophatic logic of transcendence and its implications for discourse. God is not a humanoid, and his commandments do not bear analogy to those of fleshly humanity. But his indicants shine from his essence and are to be interpreted by the community consensually in the light of its circumstances and times, as it builds what Klossowski might call the simulacrum, which is the applied sharia. Hence what Omar Farrahat calls Asharism's productive skepticism simultaneously denies an analogy between human and divine values, while affirming the human collective capacity to intuit the apparent purport of God's indicants. Community, as Farrahat puts it, is the site of the production of norms. Here, at the allegedly non-rational heart of Sunni Kalam, we locate the sense of Sunnism's self-description as the way of the prophetic precedent and the congregation, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Perhaps again there's a recollection of the doctrine of Islam's soteriological position as the creed of Ortzeit und Endzeit, the sage's auditor and cantillator of the voice of the spirit world, but the oracle is difficult and is to be assessed for relevance by the tribe as a whole, as counselled by the elders. This apophatically enabled refusal of closure runs throughout Islamic law, which is a game of approximation in which multiple correct inductive outcomes, ijtihadat, are actively received, and which before the deformation was expressed by particular versatility in the autonomous culture of the qadis. We may note that it appears in many other dimensions of Islamic culture also, and its music offers one rather suggestive manifestation of this. Quranic cantillation and Islamicate musical traditions accept a glissando of microtones, broadly regulated into modes, maqam, but assuming always a culture of improvisation. In Europe, Bach's well-tempered clavier marked the end of more subtle temperaments, imposing the equal temperament, and thus making all keys interchangeable, the only exception being the major-minor distinction. The keyboard, unlike the unfretted lute or the human voice, determined what was uniquely correct. In the 19th century, some composers, worried by the sterility of this, tried to identify keys with moods. Scriabin attempted to do it with mental colours and to interrogate the entirely random eminence of C major. In Islamic music, hundreds of modes reflecting very delicate nuances of temperament are recognised, and critically, more are constantly being added. Blas Infante, the founder of Andalusian nationalism, wrote on this in his book on flamenco, which he identified as the bearer of an Islamic intensity and capacity for repudiating simple binaries, essential for the retrieval of his people's spiritual health. Flamenco uses a variant of the Phrygian mode with a memory of the Arabic maqam Hijaz. Again, the Phrygian mode, named by the ancients after the ecstatic wild men of Asia Minor, seems to underline our point about a Dionysian Islamic subjectivity made intense by the refusal of the binary divisions enforced by Bach's rigidly tuned keyboard. This afflatus of affect is what Pierre Klossowski refers to as tonality. In shaping pre-modern Islam's Dionysian quality, it denies the Aristotelian additive quality of Occidental reason, whose apotheosis is artificial intelligence. Nietzsche's early dichotomy of Dionysus against the crucified is the context for his notorious insistence that Islam is 1,000 times right to despise Christianity. The left brain is the domain of the Apollonian, of the self, of individuation, of the additive. The right brain is the glade of Dionysus, of intoxication and the forgetting of self. If we deploy this to seek to characterize Islamic subjectivity in the midst of the Occident's machine culture, we will diagnose the Western nature of the Mu'tazilite ratio commended by Islam's cultural despisers. It is the field of prose, linearity and binaries, contrasting with the dithyrambs of Dionysius, whose elusiveness is compelled by the rhizomic indeterminacy and non-hierarchical structuring of tonality accomplished by the Muslim scripture. Islam's dissident refusal to join either the seminar table or the banquet of Apollonian global control is to be interpreted in the light of the Nietzschean rejection of Socrates' destruction of the old tragedies which balance the two. Occidental subjectivity accepts and integrates the Dionysian only as Freud's subconscious compulsions, while Nietzsche sets it beside and within us, not beneath us. Again, Klossowski's reading of Nietzsche makes this explicit. Klossowski's conversion to Islam was an ambiguous event, although recorded explicitly by his brother, the painter Balthus, and remote Muslimness rather than Islam is all we can decode as a theme in his later writings. Perhaps he was too concerned with principles to have to label them. In a sense, this doesn't matter. He's interested, like Deleuze and Guattari, in identifying an epistemic anti-Oedipus, a new mode of philosophy, but one which incorporates an implicit theology. Like modern Muslim thinkers, he seeks a therapy for modern subjectivity, identified with Nietzsche's last man, jaded by his knowing witnessing of all things, but degenerated by a close preoccupation with his self. Urban anomie, the realization of Eliot's wasteland, struggles with predictable acceleration to generate a moral ideal. The complacent loss of naivete and the failure of all traditional categories, even of gender, leads to the Neronian frenzy culture and the brilliant pointlessness of Burning Man, which Pallier warns will usher in an Islamic barbarian conquest. Mark Fisher writes of capitalist realism. Even the left recognizes the dialectical inevitability of capitalist triumph and predicts no shocks of the new. Describing the demise of the alcoholic and depressed Kurt Cobain, he writes, "In his dreadful lassitude and objectless rage, Cobain seemed to give wearied voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history." What is new about our culture is the impossibility of the new. So, and Paglia roughly asks this, is Islam, the Muslim voter, the virile Ishmaelite migrant focused on tawhid, to be this shock of the new? Not in Islamist uniform, certainly, since that uniform was designed in Rome and Edinburgh. But stripped of it, Dionysian once more, as Nietzsche and Goethe recognized, the remontée to a biophiliac archaic time, Islam as the perfect anachronism, as the missing metacritical theory. Again, Massignon, in his reflection on Abraham's great prayer for his elder son, considers this a providential vindication of the outcast par excellence of the Bible and the West, writing this. Islam is a great mystery of the divine will, the just claim, revendication, of the excluded, those exiled to the desert with their ancestor Ishmael, against the privileged ones of God, Jews and above all Christians, who have abused the divine privileges of grace. End of the Massignon quote. By writing that the blessed prophet of Islam, under God, announces the final separation of the good from the bad, and that he will one day be recognized by Jews and Christians for some chiastic reparative function, Massignon, in this oddly prophetic passage, seems to return to the Ortzeit und Endzeit trope. Ishmael's promise of a different and archaic human subjectivity will characterize his reparatory role during the end of days, and this is one key sense of Islam's khatmiyya, its sealing of history. Migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, reviled by left and right, the ultimate biblical paradigm of unchosenness, Ishmael will not only be somehow vindicated by a complicated divine plan, but will play a saving role in repairing humanity's Apollonian dysfunction and schizoid distinction between heart and mind.